In the small town of Riverdale, surrounded on all sides by meadows and small groves, with an old church as the centerpiece, the residents were accustomed to living a measured and friendly life. Wooden houses with well-kept gardens, wide streets where families walked to church on Sunday mornings, all this created a sense of comfort and peace, as if in a quiet harbor where storms never occurred. Pastor Marlon Tillman stood at the center of the town's religious life. He was 38 years old and looked younger than his age, tall and slender, with pleasant features and a reasonable look. He had a wife, LaShandra, 3 years younger, and a son named Trey, who was 6 years old. It seemed that Marlon and LaShandra were the model of an ideal family. When they got married, they were full of big plans and shared dreams. LaShandra recalled how right after their honeymoon, they were invited to serve in Riverdale. She loved the coziness of the town, where everyone knew their neighbors. And Marlon was fascinated by the sense of calling. He wanted to become a spiritual mentor, to lead the community, and to ignite people's hearts with faith. The first years of their marriage were almost uneventful. Marlon preached energetically, engaged young people in volunteer trips, and led Bible studies, while LaShandra helped him prepare events, sang in the church choir, and exuded quiet wisdom. Everyone in the town looked at them with respect, young, talented, and very much in love. The birth of their son, whom they named Trey, was like the crown of their happiness. The little boy developed in a warm atmosphere. Mother and father saw each other as partners. LaShandra knew that pastoral work takes time, and Marlon always emphasized that he appreciated her contribution to the family and the community. Together, they seemed like a solid team, able to balance spiritual ministry and everyday responsibilities. However, over time, subtle friction began to develop. At first, everything that happened might have seemed like the typical trivialities of married life. For example, Marlon is quite an ambitious person. He wanted his church to grow bigger, attract more parishioners, have a better choir, and modern activities for young people. Constant evening meetings with various groups, long meetings with the church council exhausted him, and he often returned home irritated or overly tired. LaShandra, who had helped him with the organization, was now increasingly busy taking care of 6-year-old Trey. She had to pick him up from kindergarten and then from a preschool, feed him, do minimal childhood tasks with him, and put him to bed. She also felt tired and began to complain that her husband was too involved in external affairs and left her with the housework. Domestic conflicts began to accumulate. Marlon could complain that his wife had not taken into account his favorite dishes when preparing dinner, or that she had forgotten to wash his shirt on time. LaShandra would reproach him for neglecting his household duties, and the child would constantly ask, "When is Daddy going to come and play with me?" Although these arguments seemed routine, they gradually destroyed the harmony. LaShandra felt that Marlon was pulling away. They slept at different times because the pastor returned late and had to go to a meeting in the morning. In their bedroom, aloofness reigned supreme. At the same time, there were still vestiges of intimacy between them, but their interaction was becoming increasingly difficult. All the issues were layered like dust, making it impossible to find understanding. Trey, as a child, clearly felt the change in the atmosphere at home. He could hear his parents talking in high-pitched tones over trivial matters. The hallway lamp hadn't been repaired, or one of them hadn't prepared lunch for Trey, and it was urgent. At first, the boy thought it would pass because all children sometimes heard their parents arguing, but now the noise in the apartment was becoming an almost daily occurrence. Eventually, the pastor's behavior became more tired and even irritated when he heard his wife's accusations. LaShandra, on the other hand, only wished they could spend more time together. She missed the time when they could sit on the church porch after church, smiling and discussing future plans for the congregation. When our story begins, the Tillman family was already in a kind of emotional crisis. So far, they had managed to maintain the image of an exemplary pastor and his wife, but the hidden cracks were becoming more and more apparent. It was during this period that a young representative of the charitable organization, Zoraide Fields, appeared in the town, and everything changed even more dramatically. In Riverdale, the local newspaper announced the news. The international nonprofit organization Dobrobut UA is planning a large-scale social project aimed at supporting low-income families in different parts of the country. To do this, they were looking for partners among churches and volunteers. Zoraida Fields, a 28-year-old energetic woman from a warm city in the South, became the representative of Dobrobut UA. The arrival of the philanthropist caused a stir among the parishioners of Tillman's church. People in a small town rarely saw new faces, and here comes someone from the big world with innovative ideas. Zoraida was open, smiling, and immediately wanted to talk to the local spiritual leader to enlist his support. At a Sunday service after the sermon, she met Marlon for the first time. He saw a new figure in the audience, slim, carrying a business bag, focused but with a slightly shy smile. Marlon, out of habit, came up to greet the guests after the service, and that's how they met. Zoraida briefly explained that the purpose of her visit was to organize a collection point for clothes, food, and hygiene products for the poorest families in the region, and that she was counting on the church's help. When the pastor heard about this initiative, he immediately expressed interest. Such an event could be useful for his community, show the city an example of cohesion, and strengthen the church's position as a social center. This is where LaShondra stepped in. She always enjoyed the opportunity to help people. She offered to advise on which families should be taken care of first, how best to organize storage, etc. Zoraida thanked her sincerely. Their first meetings were friendly, and LaShondra was even happy that perhaps this new joint task would allow her and her husband to take their minds off their domestic troubles and unite for a common goal. However, within a few weeks, it became clear that the pastor was taking over more and more organizational issues, justifying himself by saying that he understands church procedures better, knows the people, and has access to the facilities and resources. LaShondra seemed to be on the sidelines. Marlon explained that she was busy with Trey, and it's okay if he handles everything himself, thus almost removing his wife from the process. LaShondra did not realize where this would lead. She saw that Marlon and Zoraida spent a lot of time together, discussing lists of families in need, planning a charity event, and arranging meetings with other philanthropists. At first, this did not bother his wife. On the contrary, she was happy that their church was so actively involved. But later, anxiety began to grow when Marlon began to stay late at night, returning hunched over with a strange gleam in his eye. In one episode, LaShondra noticed Zoraida leaving the temple and talking to Marlon alone. They were standing too close. It was striking. Their gestures reminded me of two people who trust each other with some personal secrets. When LaShondra asked, the pastor waved it off. It's nothing special, just discussing logistics. Jealousy arose in LaShondra's heart. She angrily reproached herself. Maybe I'm exaggerating. I shouldn't think of my husband as a potential traitor, because he has always been a man of his word. But too often he began to justify his absence. It's all for the good of the community. Come on, be patient, dear. And at the same time, there were fewer and fewer calm conversations between the couple. A series of evening meetings between Pastor Marlon and Zoraida began, which became longer and longer. At first, everything was formal. They would sit in a small office at the church, spread out papers, and go through lists of families who needed food or clothing most. Sometimes they would discuss the details of the room where the food would be stored, but every time the conversation turned to personal topics. Zoraida, naturally open and cordial, asked how Marlon's family was doing, and whether it was difficult for him to combine the role of spiritual advisor and family man. At first, Marlon was official, saying neutral things. Everything is fine. God has blessed our marriage. But later, sensing the sincere sympathy in this young woman's eyes, he gently hinted that not everything was perfect at home. He said that household chores were eating up his time. LaShondra was nervous, and he was constantly at work. Those evenings became a moment of solitude that Marlon hadn't had in his married life for a long time. Zoraida listened to him very carefully, sometimes happy when he joked, sometimes empathizing when he mentioned the stresses associated with church politics. She admired his preaching talent, his ability to find the right word for each parishioner, and she realized more and more clearly that she saw him as more than just a colleague in her charitable work. On one of these evenings, when the clock was already ticking around 10 o'clock, they both noticed that they had long since finished their official business, but were still sitting around, chatting, drinking tea and laughing. Marlon admitted that he could rarely share his thoughts so freely with someone, because everyone expects perfection from him. Zoraida responded by telling him how difficult it was for her to win the trust of her colleagues at Dobrobut UA, because she is a woman and often faces prejudice against youth. At that moment, they felt a special closeness between them, not only professional sympathy, but also something deeper that began to awaken in their souls. Marlon found himself thinking more and more often that he was looking forward to the next joint planning session. Zoraida, returning to the rented house, wondered when she would see him again. Inside, the pastor hesitated. He realized that he was crossing a line. On the one hand, everyone saw him as an exemplary family man, and on the other hand, no law or preacher justifies adultery. However, the emotional hunger he felt because of the cooling in his relationship with Lashandra pushed him further and further away. His wife Lashandra began to notice small signals. Marlon would suddenly stop talking on the phone if she walked into the room, looking a little embarrassed. Whenever Lashandra asked where he was until late at night, he would answer, "I was working on a plan with Zoraida. You know how important that is." This annoyed her because it reminded her that he was not consulting her at all, as he used to, but running off to another woman, even if it was for work matters. One night was a turning point. Marlon and Zoraida, stayed in the church warehouse, where they were taking boxes of food and clothes. The daylight had already faded, and the windows were illuminated only by a street lamp that cast dim rays. Cold shelves, the smell of dust and paper from the boxes. The work was almost finished, and Zoraida leaned on a large box to rest. Marlon, standing next to her, touched her shoulder involuntarily, as if he wanted to say something, and their eyes flashed with understanding. They both knew what they were doing was unacceptable, but they couldn't stop. It was a short kiss, but one that seemed to confirm that there was a strong attraction between them. And then there was more. Zoraida whispered that she was scared of the situation, because she did not want to destroy anyone's family, and was afraid that she would be the one who would be cursed later. Marlon, in turn, admitted that he was unhappy in his marriage, tired of the constant fighting, and did not want to lose everything. However, at that moment, his self-control disappeared. Two adults in a state of emotional exhaustion surrendered to passion. This connection was short, frantic, and full of forbidden feelings. Returning home after this duty, Marlon looked at his watch. It was almost midnight, and he didn't even feel ashamed. Rather, a slight feeling of high from something new and secret. From that evening on, their intrigue began to develop faster. They began to schedule working meetings more often, inventing new excuses. Even if sometimes it was really about sorting parcels, the conversation quickly turned personal and ended with a hug or a passionate kiss. In his sermons, Marlon, on the other hand, gained special expressiveness and fire. His parishioners noticed that he seemed to have blossomed. He shone with confidence and delivered his sermons with even more passion. Some jokingly said that the pastor was inspired by God. However, Lashandra saw that his inspiration was clearly not from a renewed spiritual experience, but from something else. One night, when he returned very late, Lashandra decided to ask him a direct question. "Do you spend all your evenings with this Zoraida now? Why can't I participate in the same gatherings?" Marlon replied sharply, "You're exaggerating. There is a lot of work to do, and you have enough to do at home." This tone was new to her, because he used to explain himself in some way, but now he just cut her off. She felt a sharp resentment, as if he was now refusing her advice and help, not offering her a place in the circle he had formed with Zoraida. Gone were the days when they would prepare spiritual evenings or children's parties at church together. And although Lashandra tried her best to remain calm, she had a growing feeling in her heart that she was being pushed away and that someone else was taking her place next to her husband. The situation worsened when Lashanda, on her way to take her son Trey to the doctor, he had a cold and needed to see a pediatrician, took Marlon's car because her own was being repaired. She opened the trunk to put the child's backpack with his belongings and suddenly noticed a small bag with the Dobrobut UA logo on it. The logo was recognizable. Zoraida wore the same one on her jacket. The bag was not Lashandra's, and it certainly could not be Trey's. Her hands shook. She knew it was no accident. She tried to calm herself down, saying that maybe Zoraida had just asked me to deliver some cards or something for charity and had forgotten. but her heart was still racing. Why didn't my husband tell me that he was taking her somewhere so late? When Marlon returned home that evening, Lashandra asked, "What is this bag? Should I help you give it back to the owner?" The pastor refused to explain, saying something like, "Stay out of this. I'll handle it. Don't make it difficult." His reaction was rude and obviously nervous. It only reinforced his wife's suspicions. Things got worse from there. Lashandra tried to talk to him frankly, saying, "It's like you've been replaced. You're not interested in the family at all. We have a child who wants your attention. You said yourself that we should work together in the church, and you're giving everything to some stranger." Instead of explaining, Marlon began to get angry, saying, "I'm giving myself to the ministry, and you're just complaining." It was through these domestic clashes that Lashandra felt she had to look for evidence of infidelity, because her husband's behavior became more withdrawn every day. Several times she saw him scribbling on his phone, smiling, and when she appeared in the room, he would immediately put the phone away. Soon after, another situation occurred that heightened Lashandra's anxiety. One late night, she went out to get water, and her husband was lying on the couch with his phone. She heard him whisper, "Good night, I miss you too." When she asked him who he was talking to, he replied indifferently, "No one. I was just checking a message from one of the parishioners." Quarrels occurred almost every day, and the pastor's house, which had once been filled with prayers and warm family conversations, was now filled with shouts, reproaches, and muffled tears. When Trey woke up, he saw his mother standing in the hallway with her arms around her head, and his father slamming the door and leaving angrily, "I have things to do at church." At this time, Marlon and Zoraida's romance gained new momentum. They no longer hesitated to express their feelings in evening conversations. Marlon saw Zoraida as someone to whom he could complain about his wife's excessive demands. Zoraida felt needed and loved, which flattered her, even though she realized that it was all a sin and a risk. Lashandra's suspicions grew, and she felt that her patience was about to be broken. She walked around depressed all day long. During the day, she worked out with Trey, answered calls from friends at church, and in the evening, she tried to at least start a frank conversation with her husband. But Marlon would not make contact, grumbling irritably, "Don't start that again," and then either walked away or turned away from the wall in bed. Finally, there was a time when Lashandra, returning home with her child, noticed Marlon's car on another street in the town. It wasn't the kind of place where parishioners or friends usually lived. She stopped and took a closer look. Yes, that was indeed Marlon's license plate. Inside, in the passenger seat, was a woman who resembled Zoraida. Soon the car moved off and drove away, and Lashandra realized with a painful lump in her throat that the deception was becoming obvious. She didn't want to make a scene in the street, especially in front of her child, but she felt as if she had been stabbed in the back. When Marlon returned home, his wife asked him directly, "Where were you this time?" "I saw your car in the neighborhood." He started making excuses again. "I was helping Zoraida deliver parcels to a family who didn't want to be seen in public." Some confusing story that sounded dubious. Lashandra didn't listen. Her nerves gave out. "You're lying to me. I know something is going on between you two." Marlon, feeling his back was against the wall, began to raise his voice, saying, "You're making up stories. You're just jealous, and I'm doing my job as a pastor." This time, however, Lashandra did not back down. She demanded that he show her his phone, his correspondence, or explain the situation in some logical way. He pulled out of her arms and slammed the bedroom door. That evening passed in oppressive silence. Hearing the screams, the child began to cry, and Lashandra rushed to calm Trey, explaining, "Mommy and Daddy had a little fight. Everything will be fine." But she didn't believe her own words. The realization that her husband, a pastor, a man trusted by so many people, was actually leading a double life was a shock. The next morning, Lashandra took advantage of Marlon's leaving the house for a few minutes to take out the trash and leaving his phone charging in the hallway to pick it up. She said to herself, "I'd rather find out than go completely crazy with suspicion." Her hands trembled in her robe pocket as she unlocked the screen. She knew the password because they had shared phones before without any problems. The messenger contained what she was most afraid of: explicit messages. There were cute messages and alleged plans for the evening. "Give me a hug when we meet. I'll be waiting in the warehouse again today." and so on. And all this with Zoraida's number. The conversation was so romantic and intimate that Lashandra didn't need any further proof. Of course, the pastor suddenly returned at that moment. When he saw his wife holding his phone, he snatched it out of her hand and exclaimed, "What are you doing?" And she answered through tears, "How could you? You lied to me and cheated on me." It was a critical point. Trey was not at home at the time. His grandmother took him away for the weekend. So the fight took place without witnesses. Lashandra shouted that he was shamelessly trampling on their marriage vows, that she would tell the congregation so they would know what a holy man they had, preaching morality and honesty. Marlon felt stuck in a quandary. On the one hand, he realized that he had lost control, and on the other hand, he was angry that his wife had dared to interfere with his personal correspondence, as if that made him less guilty. At the peak of this quarrel, Lashandra threw him a curveball. "You're a hypocrite who is destroying the family. How will you look our son in the eye when he finds out what you're doing?" Marlon grimaced, clenched his fists, his heart pounding, and his mind blurred by the adrenaline rush. He began screaming insults, accusing Lashandra of being always unhappy, not supporting him in big things, and now going to embarrass him in front of everyone. These are the words. "I'm going to tell the whole church tomorrow who you really are," prompted Marlon to do what happened next. He saw his wife standing on the top step between the floors of their house and felt an explosive anger building up in his chest. In a fit of panic, he sharply, aggressively pushed Lashandra. She had no place to retreat, lost her balance, and flailing her arms desperately, flew down the stairs. Her piercing scream was muffled by the dull sound of impact as her body hit the hard steps and then the floor. Marlon ran downstairs and saw Lashandra lying motionless, staring at the ceiling with a blurred gaze, blood oozing from her head. He immediately realized what he had done. His heart nearly broke. "Oh my God, what have I done?" He ran over and felt for a pulse. Weak, almost absent. His wife didn't move, only whispered something indistinctly. Marlon remembered that he needed to call an ambulance, but immediately realized that it would be difficult to explain such an injury. Despite his panic, he pulled out his phone and called 911, saying, "My wife fell down the stairs. Well, it was an accident," but his voice was shaking and his words sounded unconvincing. The ambulance arrived quickly, but Lashandra was no longer breathing. The doctors tried to resuscitate him, but it was all in vain. The impact on the steps was incompatible with life. Marlon sat on the floor with his hands over his head, repeating, "It was an accident. I didn't mean to. She slipped." However, it was clear to anyone in that situation that the couple had had a quarrel and had had physical contact. The police arrived and examined the scene. Neighbors said they heard loud screams and then sudden silence. They found signs of a struggle in the house, scattered things, an overturned vase. When one of the police officers was asked to go up the stairs, he noticed a phone with a broken screen lying on the floor next to the stairs, probably dropped by Lashandra. Seeing a fragment of SMS correspondence on the display, the officer realized that it was his wife who was reading the messages at the time of the quarrel. And although the messages themselves had gone out, there were already grounds for suspicion. All these little things added up to a picture. The pastor seemed to have pushed his wife on purpose or in a fit of anger, and she fell down the stairs and smashed her head. Luckily, the child Trey was not at home at the time. Lashandra's relatives had just taken him for a walk, but the night in the house was filled with police sirens and the voices of paramedics pronouncing death. In the silence that replaced the hustle and bustle, Marlon sat in despair, not knowing what to say. The officers took him to the police station for questioning, where he tried to argue, "It was just an accident, she tripped." When the police learned from Lashandra's family and friends that the couple had long been quarreling, and when they found out that the pastor had another woman, they began to lean toward the version of intentional violence. Meanwhile, Zoraida heard about the tragedy from her rented house. At first, she was told by friends from the church that Lashandra was dead. She could not believe that the situation had gone so far. She began to feel guilty. Did my presence destroy the family? Finally, she was also afraid for herself, thinking that the community might accuse her of being the cause of the betrayal. The scandal erupted as soon as the news spread through the town. Everyone who had considered Pastor Tillman a saintly man now asked in confusion, "How can this be? Is our Marlon a murderer?" Some believed that it was unintentional, while others believed that he was only pretending to be righteous, but in fact had long been a traitor. Social networks of local residents exploded first with sympathy, then with indignation. The police launched an official investigation. They interviewed Zoraida. She admitted that she had an affair with the pastor, but never meant to hurt LaShondra. It just happened. Of course, it was painful for her to admit that her relationship with a married man had led to such a tragedy. From the point of view of the investigation, she became an important witness. She confirmed that Marlon complained about his wife, talked about the discord, and that they had quarrels. Although he did not plan to kill directly, he cannot be fully justified either. The trial, which began a few months later, became a high-profile event, not only in Riverdale, but throughout the county. People came to the courthouse to see the disgraced Pastor Tillman, who had once been a spiritual authority for them. Marlon looked broken, his eyes extinguished. The lawyer tried to defend the accident version, claiming that the couple had been having a quarrel, but the pastor allegedly wanted to pass by and pushed her by accident. However, the prosecutor laid out all the facts: the recorded quarrels, the infidelity with Zoraida, the correspondence that LaShondra found, her threats of exposure. All of this testified to a motive. It also turned out that during the interrogation, Marlon was confused several times, first stating that his wife slipped, then that he tried to hold her. However, there was enough evidence of a physical altercation. LaShondra's body had bruises on her forearms, and Marlon's hands had scratches that indicated a small but real resistance. The sentence included imprisonment for Marlon. The court found that it was manslaughter, but with gross negligence, or intentional harm. The judge emphasized in his closing remarks, "The fact that you were a spiritual leader does not absolve you of responsibility. On the contrary, you have even more moral obligations." The pastor was sentenced to several years in prison, or more, depending on the version of the story. It came as a shock to the community. Many people who had trusted Marlon's sermons now lost faith in his honesty. The church fell into decline as some of the congregation left, believing that this place is tainted with sin, while others stayed. But one way or another, the pastor's credibility was lost. Little Trey was taken into the care of LaShondra's relatives. The boy missed his mother very much, looking for explanations why his father was not at home. Adults told him that there had been an accident, that his father was away. However, later when he grew up, he would learn the whole truth. Zoraida, deeply upset, announced to Dobrobut UA her intention to relocate her activities and close the project in Riverdale, feeling rejected by the townspeople and, most importantly, her moral responsibility. For her, this story became a painful punishment. She really wanted to help people, but instead she destroyed her family and unwittingly led to the death of the pastor's wife. She packed her things and left, leaving the town with a bitter taste in her mouth. Thus, the whole idyllic picture of Riverdale, where the pastor and his family seemed to be an example, collapsed in a single moment. The locals could not recover for a long time from the thought that the man they trusted was capable of betrayal and violence. It took a year to find a new pastor, and the place never again had the special warmth for which it was once known. In conclusion, we can say that this story is a warning of how families are destroyed when there is no sincerity and respect. When small daily quarrels are not resolved but accumulate, even a pious image does not save you from a fatal mistake. And the good intentions with which Zoraida came could not save her from becoming an accomplice in someone else's tragedy.